right now I'm going to talk about a set of interrelated papers with my collaborator, Stef Shuster, who couldn't make it to Dartmouth. But nonetheless, I don't want to discount their contribution. They're the gender scholar, they're the qualitative scholar, they're the social movement scholar. I'm just here to be the face of our project. But the theme that connects all these different papers together is that we're interested in using the computational model that all of you here are contributing to improve prediction of voter behavior. Behaviors such as what people vote for, how people feel. And we're interested in understanding how public figures frame objective facts. For example, when you're presented with a table showing that temperatures on Earth are increasing over time, can you characterize that as the Earth is actually warming, global warming is happening? Or do you characterize it as the scientists are just fudging the data? So there are different ways to characterize objective facts, different ways to frame them. We're interested in the interplay between those frames and voter ideology, because that can help explain why certain segments of the population see those graphs of the temperatures. Why half of them think that scientists are fudging the data, and the other half think that, indeed, global warming is a thing. So we're interested in that interplay. So I'm going to talk about in depth the first publication that come out of this particular project, and then I'll go briefly review some of the other papers that we're thinking about doing. So first I want to talk about how we're conceptualizing or modeling voter ideology. So we view voter ideology, or ideology in general, as shaping people's fundamental sentiments, those EPA ratings, towards identities that are important for that particular ideology. Now this does not fit with most of the ACP research, which shows cultural consensus. And I've got citations here to the two works that are most closely aligned to what we're talking about today. So the ideology that we're going to talk about is gender ideology, so for that Amy's work here. We're also talking about some climate politics. Highest in 1979 did look at conservatism. And in both sets of studies, we found consensus by gender ideology and by political ideology, conservatism. So why do we think that ideology can indeed impact these EPA ratings? We think under certain cases, political battles, political elections, it creates enough drama that crystallizes these boundaries between these groups, between these ideologies associated with those groups, which then creates those differences, exaggerates those differences in cultural sentiments. Now, we can't test this directly. We haven't tested this directly yet. We are planning on doing that, but for now, let's just accept that assumption. Yes, based on this other research, but again, even then they did not directly test this particular assumption. It's untested assumption that we're relying our work upon. So the particular case that we looked at for this first publication is the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment has a long history. Basically, it's trying to enshrine inside the Constitution equality based on sex. Not relying upon Supreme Courts or legislatures, because what they can give, they can also take away. If it's enshrined, codified, then that Constitution becomes more difficult to take away. So there's a movement to amend at the federal level the Constitution to secure gender rights. Now, in 1972, at the federal level, the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, came close to being a reality. It moved to the states for ratification. Several states ratified it, but then things started to slow down. Things started to slow down. People who were for the Equal Rights Amendment started to get worried, so they moved to the states. They started working with states to get them to pass Equal Rights Amendments for their state level constitutions. The data, the historical archives that we looked at, focus on one of these states, in Iowa. In 1980, they were close to amending their state level constitution. It passed the state legislature in Iowa in order to amend the state level constitution, as passed the state legislature, and then also get majority vote from the citizens here in Iowa. So we look at public communication about that voter referendum in 1980 to amend the state level constitution, which wound up failing. This is particularly important for social movement researchers, who oftentimes, they usually study successful social movements. That's a bias that people talk about for those social movement scholars. Most of their data comes from successful social movements. Here in this particular case, though, we have rich historical information about a failed social movement, which makes this a very interesting case to look at. So as we started to wade in the library through these archives, reading these public communications, people characterizing the Equal Rights Amendment there in Iowa, we noticed that they started to characterize women very differently in these public communications. And we refer to these different characterizations as unique ideologies: conservative family values ideology and feminist ideology. So to go through an example of each, and also talk about how we assign EPA ratings for that identity of a woman. So in conservative family values ideology, here's an example of public communication talking about women. So in America, a man's first significant purchase is diamonds for his bride, and the largest financial investment is a home for her to live in. These are gifts for women, things like that. The man gives to a woman. We tend to bestow gifts on people who are good. So we assign an evaluation rating on the tip. What exactly is the woman doing to receive these gifts? Not just sitting around waiting for the knight in shining armor to show up, basically. They're not doing anything to receive these gifts other than being a good individual. So we label them as weak and also inactive. Now contrast this with the other ideology, feminist ideology. So one of the things that existed in our campaign was sold Mother's Day gifts and described this gift as, quote, a gift of equality in recognition that the women we honor, so moms, on this special day have earned and deserve a place in our state constitution. So like the conservative family values ideology, we see that they're talking about giving gifts to women, mothers. So we assign a positive evaluation. Women are seen as good here. But unlike conservative family values ideology, women here are actually doing something to receive these gifts. It says here they earned and deserve this gift. They're actually potent and active in this particular ideology. And then as we sort of wade through more in the archives, we noticed that there were two strategies, framing strategies, that people who were talking about the Equal Rights Amendment used to predict what may happen if people voted for or against this particular amendment. And we labeled them two different strategies. We've got a frame resonance strategy. This is something that we created. It's not a concept that we came up with. It's just something that we saw aligning well with social movements literature. They talk about frame resonance strategy. This is a strategy that casts events as aligning, confirming a particular ideology. There's an example of this. If you believe in the principles of equality, have this ideology, then do this. Vote yes for the Iowa Equal Rights Amendment. If you believe that men and women should be equal in the eyes of the law, vote yes. Voting for this will confirm your ideology. And then we also saw something that was quite different. That doesn't really appear in the social movement literature. We call this frame dissonance strategy. This is casting events as opposing, disconfirming a particular ideology. And here's an example of it here. In Colorado, the legislation changed. So they passed an equal rights amendment there in the state of Colorado. It changed the word husband to spouse, a sex-neutral term. So they passed the Equal Rights Amendment, and because of it, the following happened. It meant that wives now are obligated to support their husbands. Obligated sounds like they're being forced. They don't want to do it. It's just confirming what wives should be doing. And so the reason why this particular case here is also interesting is because it's a rare opportunity to directly compare a strategy that most social movement scholars recognize, frame residence, with a completely different kind of strategy that they haven't talked about, but aligns well with ACT research. According to ACT research, a framed business strategy should be more able to mobilize people. It should be quite successful. Framed residence, according to social movement scholars, tends to secure success of a social movement. So this is an opportunity to pit one against the other. So we had to take these archives, public communications, translate that prose into events. So this is how we did it. We identified different themes of the way people would characterize, frame, talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. There are 60 of these. 3 themes per side for and against the Equal Rights Amendment for a total of 6 themes. Of these 6 themes, 1 was a resident strategy, and the other 5 were that dissident strategy. We then asked 2 undergraduate RAs, look at this prose associated with these frames, identify the implied events. We then asked a completely different set of undergraduate research assistants to use the labels in that 1978 dictionary, which was close to 1980, use those labels to identify synonyms for the behaviors and identities that the first set of RAs came up with, to link that prose to the actual labels that are available in that 1978 dictionary. So here's a table that appears in the publication that shows the different events that we use to model the 6 frames. And so I won't go through all of these, we'll just talk about the first one here. Inclusion of women in the Constitution is the idea that if you vote for the Equal Rights Amendment, you will secure women's rights, basically. So the implied event here is a voter is helping women. The identity of voter is unfortunately not available in 1978 dictionary. The closest synonym that the undergraduate RAs came up with, client and Townsend. Behavior, various different synonyms that we would associate with helping someone secure their rights. And then we've got the object, woman. Same thing for all the rest of these. So what we did was we crossed the actor, behavior, and the object to create different events. We ran each event by those ideologies, meaning that every time that you see woman on here, we input into interact those EPA profiles that I talked about earlier. And we also ran it by the sex of the procedures, the male and female data that are available in interact, for a total number of 392 simulations. Here is a summary of some of our results here, also taken from the publication. So what I've got here bars that represent each of the 6 themes. I'm graphing here the average reflection score produced by the events we use to represent those themes. Now, there are a couple of things here from this graph that I want to point out. First is that we've got this line here that goes across. This line represents the reflection score of 8, which we took from Kate Boyle's work, that 8, the value of 8, and differentiates between a likely and unlikely events. Anything above an 8, we characterize as a framed business strategy. Below 8, resident strategy. So these simulations confirm what we interpreted, Steph and I, the researchers, what we interpreted as being 2 distinct strategies. They have different characters to them. The other thing that I want to point out here is that the frame resonance strategy, of course, produces less reflection than the frame dissonance strategy. We know in ACT that those frame dissonance strategies, the events that produce greater deflection, they're much more likely to produce mobilization, to produce behavior. So this suggests that frame dissonance should be more successful than frame resonance, which is not what the social movement researchers are talking about. Now, there is one set of findings I want to talk about that isn't in the publication that's directly relevant to our greater concern, which is looking at the interplay between frames and voter ideology. So we did look at interactions between these themes and between ideology. So what I had here in this graph, this is aggregated across ideology, but there are significant interactions that I'll talk about right now. So compared to feminist ideology, conservative family values ideology produces a reflection score that is 4.48 points higher for this one right here, which is women fighting in combat, 2.61 points higher for women infringing upon a husband's role in the family, and then 0.68 points lower for that frame resonance strategy, which is inclusion of women in the Constitution. Now, we don't know, we can't tell if these statistically significant differences in reflection scores actually produce meaningful substantive differences in behavior. We don't know that, we can't test that, but we're still happy because this does align with the political psychology literature, which finds that people with right-wing attitudes, conservative attitudes, they tend to be more apt to perceive threats and respond to threats. So this is consistent with that literature. So it seems promising to take this particular route. So in summary, what did we learn about the IOERA? It likely failed because the strategy that was used by the pro side was a frame resonance strategy. Those not used by the anti side, and create that frame dissonance strategy. It is a rare case that frame resonance did not secure success. We're out of the ordinary. Well, we can explain why using ACT. And lastly, Interact is useful for modeling these events, modeling likely behaviors in an archival data set. We couldn't travel back in time and interview people in 1980, but we could infer what was going on using that dictionary. Right. So now future directions. The first one is testing that claim, that assumption that we're basing our research on, that contentious battles crystallize these differences between groups, their ideologies, and that leads to distinct fundamental techniques. The other paper that we're going to do, so these archives are very, very rich. One piece of information that is in these archives are what voters felt. It's not perfect data. The only way that we know what voters felt is whenever a voter happened to have written into the newspaper and characterized their emotions. So it's not perfect, but we are going to triangulate it with other data, doing a vignette experiment, asking people how they feel when they read certain frames. We're also going to, of course, analyze the 2016 presidential election. We're going to have, we already had undergraduate RAs code the first presidential debate, and they're going to go through the second and third presidential debate. This is an interesting case, not just because we want to figure out what in the world is happening, but it's an interesting case because when these debates are being televised, Trump and Clinton are right there, right next to each other, characterizing objective reality differently. So a viewer can directly compare these different frames, these different characterizations. So that makes an interesting case. I want to link it back to polling data following those presidential debates. And lastly, Steph and I, we moonlight as medical sociologists, so we thought we should kind of do something in medical sociology. Death with dignity acts have been passing in certain states, even in the past presidential cycle. Death with dignity acts make it legal for a terminally ill patient, someone who's been told they have 6 months or less to live. It makes it legal for a terminally ill patient to request a doctor prescribe medication that will end their life. Contentious battle, as you can imagine. So that's the objective reality of what the act does. And as you can imagine, there are different ways to characterize what that is. Is a physician easy the suffering, helping a patient? Or is it a way for people to get rid of people who are disformed, who are handicapped, for example? And so we want to like different ways to characterize different frames that were used. Talk about death with dignity acts to Google search terms. So these last two projects, we're trying to link this modeling procedure back to actual behavior. So thank you. Of course, this is me. I'm here.